"I'm leaving Lucian. You can't keep me here." Amelia sobbed, her trembling hands instinctively protecting her slightly rounded stomach. Lucian didn't flinch. He simply stepped closer, locking the heavy mahogany door. "Leave your carrying the Costello heir. I got you pregnant on purpose, Amelia. You're mine forever now." Amelia Henderson had survived 24 years of life by mastering the art of being invisible. At 5'4" and carrying 230 pounds of soft, unapologetic curves, society had always been quick to either scrutinize her or look right through her. In the opulent, terrifying world of the Costello family, being looked through was not just a preference. It was a survival tactic. For the past 2 years, Amelia had worked as a maid in the Costello estate, a sprawling, heavily fortified limestone mansion nestled deep in Chicago's exclusive Astor Street district. She wasn't blind. She knew who paid her exorbitant weekly salary in crisp, untraceable $100 bills. She knew why she had been forced to sign an ironclad, non-disclosure agreement engineered by Goldman & Reed, the city's most ruthless defense firm. And she certainly knew why her duties occasionally included scrubbing crimson stains out of imported Persian rugs at 3 in the morning. The Costellos ran Chicago, and Lucian Costello, the 32-year-old newly crowned head of the syndicate, ran the Costellos. Lucian was a man carved from ice and violence. With sharp, aristocratic features, piercing dark eyes, and a reputation that made hardened criminals cross the street. He moved through the mansion like a predatory ghost. He was usually surrounded by a revolving door of statuesque, impossibly thin supermodels and socialites, women who viewed Amelia as nothing more than part of the expensive antique furniture. Amelia preferred it that way. Her standard-issue black dress and white apron were her armor. Her size, she believed, made her completely uninteresting to a man who could have anyone in the world. She was wrong. It began on a freezing Tuesday evening in November. A summit had been held in the estate's grand dining room, a tense, high-stakes meeting between Lucian and the warring heads of the North Side factions. The air in the house was thick with the scent of expensive Cuban cigars, spilled bourbon, and raw adrenaline. Amelia's job was to remain silent, keep the crystal glasses full, and disappear into the shadows. As she navigated the room carrying a silver tray of fresh espresso, her eyes caught something highly irregular. One of the men, a lieutenant loyal to Lucian's bitter rival Carmine, had lingered far too close to the beverage station. Amelia had seen the swift, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist over Lucian's designated demi-tasse cup. A faint dusting of white powder caught the dim chandelier light on the rim of the porcelain. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She was just a maid. If she spoke up and was wrong, Lucian would likely have her thrown into the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. But as Lucian reached out his scarred, perfectly manicured hand to take the poisoned cup, Amelia's instincts hijacked her self-preservation. She didn't speak. Instead, she purposefully tripped. With a loud gasp, Amelia pitched her considerable weight forward, slamming her shoulder into the mahogany cart. The silver tray went flying. Hot espresso, broken porcelain, and whatever lethal substance had been in the cup shattered across the priceless rug, splashing directly onto Lucian's custom-tailored Tom Ford shoes. The room erupted. 3 men drew concealed firearms in a synchronized heartbeat. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, dropping to her hands and knees in the steaming puddle, her entire heavy frame shaking violently. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Costello," she cried out, her voice trembling. "I'm so clumsy. Please, I tripped on the hem of my apron." The silence that followed was deafening. The men looked to Lucian, waiting for the order to drag the careless fat maid out by her hair. But Lucian didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes narrowing, not at the mess, but at the white powder, now fizzing slightly against the spilled hot liquid on the floor. A very specific, highly toxic reaction. Lucian slowly raised his hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons. He looked at the rival lieutenant, who had suddenly gone deathly pale, and then down at the terrified soft woman cowering at his feet. "Get out!" Lucian commanded, his voice a low, lethal baritone. It wasn't directed at Amelia. It was directed at the room. Within seconds, the dining hall was cleared by his enforcers, dragging the screaming lieutenant with them. Once the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Lucian knelt. He didn't care about the broken glass or the ruined shoes. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, gently gripping Amelia's chin, forcing her to look up at him. She expected rage. Instead, she found a terrifying, burning curiosity in his gaze. "You didn't trip, did you, Amelia?" he murmured, using her name for the very first time. I am just clumsy, sir." She stammered, tears tracking down her flushed, rounded cheeks. Lucian's thumb brushed away a tear, the gesture shockingly tender for a man who had just ordered a death sentence. "You saw him, and you put yourself in the line of fire to stop it." His eyes dropped to her soft, trembling mouth, then back to her wide, panicked eyes. "Why?" "Because you're my boss," she whispered, desperate to look away. "And it's my job to take care of this house." Lucian stood up smoothly, pulling her to her feet, with a strength that belied his elegant frame. He looked at her, really looked at her. He took in the soft curve of her hips, the fullness of her breasts heaving with anxiety, the warm, flushed skin that no amount of oversized cotton could hide. In a world full of plastic women and hollow loyalty, this soft, invisible maid had just risked her life for him without a second thought. "You're no longer cleaning the lower levels," Lucian stated coldly, turning toward the door. "From now on, you answer only to me. You are restricted to my private wing. Tell Beatrice I said so." Amelia's stomach plummeted. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had stepped out of the shadows. And Lucian Costello had finally seen her. The transition into Lucian's private quarters was swift and suffocating. Amelia went from being a ghost in a bustling mansion to a captive bird in a gilded, terrifyingly quiet cage. The third floor of the Astor Street mansion was Lucian's sanctuary. It was impenetrable, accessible only by a private elevator that required biometric scanning. For the first few weeks, Amelia tried to maintain her professional distance. She ironed his shirts, arranged his meals, and kept his massive cold bedroom immaculate. But the dynamic had irreparably shifted. Lucian was always there. He began working from his private study rather than downtown. He would watch her with heavy, unblinking eyes as she dusted the bookshelves or plumped his pillows. The attention made Amelia intensely self-conscious. She was acutely aware of her size, constantly tugging at her uniform, trying to hide the soft rolls of her stomach and the thickness of her thighs. But Lucian's gaze never held disgust. It held a dark, consuming hunger that terrified her far more. He began leaving gifts. First it was small things, a box of imported Swiss chocolates left on her cleaning cart. Then it escalated. Her standard scratchy polyester uniforms were suddenly replaced with custom-made, incredibly soft silk and Egyptian cotton dresses that hugged her curves rather than hiding them. When she tried to refuse them, Lucian simply had the old uniforms burned. Amelia knew she had to leave. The air around him was too thick, the unspoken tension too heavy. One evening, after gathering her courage, she knocked on the door of his study. "Mr. Costello." She began clutching a typed resignation letter in her sweaty hands. "I am giving my 2 weeks' notice. I appreciate everything, but I need to move on." Lucian was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, nursing a glass of Macallan 25. He didn't look surprised. He took a slow sip, his eyes tracking her nervously shifting weight. "Is that so?" he asked softly. He pressed a button on his desk, bringing up a secure feed on his monitor. He turned the screen toward her. "Where will you go, Amelia? Back to the damp basement apartment in Logan Square, the one owned by Oakmont Holdings." Amelia froze. "How do you know my landlord?" "I don't know your landlord, Amelia. I am your landlord. I bought the building 3 weeks ago." Lucian stood up, pacing slowly around the desk like a panther cornering its prey. "I also happen to know that your sister Sarah in Seattle just received a massive anonymous grant that paid off her medical debts entirely. You see, I am a very thorough man. I protect what belongs to me." "I don't belong to you," Amelia gasped, stepping back as he approached. Panic flared in her chest. "You can't do this. I'm just a maid. I'm fat. I'm plain. I'm nobody to you. Why are you doing this?" Lucian stopped inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and danger rolled off him in waves. He reached out his large hands, settling firmly on her waist, his fingers digging possessively into the soft flesh of her hips. "You think your size repulses me?" he whispered, fiercely leaning down so his lips brushed her ear. "You think I want those starving, hollow women who look at me and only see a bank account? I look at you, and I see warmth. I see loyalty. I see a woman who threw herself in front of a bullet for a man she barely knew. You are soft, Amelia. You are real. And you are exactly what I need to anchor me to this earth before the violence of my life drags me under." Amelia trembled, tears spilling over her lashes. "Lucian, please. I don't belong in your world." "You belong wherever I put you," he corrected smoothly, his thumbs tracing the curve of her waist. "You can't leave Amelia. Your apartment lease is cancelled. Your sister is safe because of my money. But if you run, my protection vanishes. Stay. Let me take care of you. Be mine." It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum wrapped in velvet. That night marked the end of Amelia the maid. Defeated and overwhelmed by a terrifying mixture of fear and dark, undeniable arousal, she surrendered. When Lucian came to her small adjoining bedroom later that night, there were no more barriers. He stripped away her uniform with a reverence that left her sobbing. For a man so immersed in brutality, his touch was agonizingly gentle. He worshipped her heavy curves, praising every soft inch of her body that she had spent her life hating until she forgot her fears, forgot the Mafia, and completely lost herself in him. It became their dangerous routine. By day, she remained quietly in his quarters. By night, she shared his massive, king-sized bed, tangled in silk sheets, and his unyielding embrace. He was obsessed, borderline manic in his need to have her near. But Amelia still harbored a secret, desperate hope of escape. She quietly squirreled away the cash tips she found in his pockets, planning to eventually flee when he let his guard down. She meticulously took her birth control pills every single morning, determined not to tie herself permanently to a mob boss whose enemies were constantly plotting his murder. What Amelia didn't know was that a man like Lucian Costello never left anything to chance. 2 months into her captivity, the exhaustion hit her. At first, she blamed it on the stress of her secluded life and the intense, demanding nights with Lucian. But then came the morning sickness, the violent nausea that left her clinging to the porcelain edge of the toilet in his master bathroom. One crisp Monday morning, Amelia stood in the center of the bathroom, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the plastic stick. She stared down at the two bright pink lines. Pregnant? No, she whispered to the blood draining from her face. No, no, no. I take my pills. I never miss a day. Frantically, she tore open her toiletry bag and pulled out the circular plastic dial of her birth control. She popped one of the tiny white pills out and crushed it between her fingernails. Instead of the bitter, chalky medication she was used to, it crumbled easily into a sweet, familiar dust. Sugar. They were sugar pills. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The lock on her door clicking open made her gasp. Lucien stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his eyes dropping immediately to the positive test in her trembling hand. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across his lips. The trap hadn't just closed, it had locked permanently. I'm leaving, Lucien. You can't keep me here, Amelia sobbed, her trembling hands instinctively protecting her slightly rounded stomach. The realization that he had replaced her medication with sugar pills was a profound violation, a terrifying confirmation of his absolute control. Lucien didn't flinch. He simply stepped closer, his tailored suit shifting flawlessly with his predatory movements, and locked the heavy mahogany door. Leave your carrying the Costello air. I got you pregnant on purpose, Amelia. You're mine forever now. You're a monster, she whispered, backing away, until her spine hit the cold marble of the bathroom vanity. I trusted you. You surrendered to me, he corrected, closing the distance between them and caging her in with his arms resting on the marble on either side of her hips. And I secured my investment. Did you really think I would let you slip away, taking my cash from my pockets to fund some grand escape to a mediocre life? You are meant for this empire. You are meant for me. He reached out his large, calloused palm, resting warmly against the soft, thick flesh of her belly. A shiver tore through Amelia. The terrifying truth was that, beneath her panic and outrage, a dark, shameful part of her felt deeply anchored by his possessiveness. Life in the Astor Street mansion shifted drastically overnight. If Amelia had been in a gilded cage before it was now reinforced with titanium. Lucien brought in Dr. Thomas Harrison from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a top-tier obstetrician on the Costello payroll, to monitor her progress daily. Her diet was meticulously curated, her stress levels aggressively managed. As the months passed, Amelia's body blossomed. The pregnancy amplified her curves, making her softer, heavier, and distinctly maternal. To her immense surprise, Lucien's obsession only intensified with her physical changes. While society had conditioned her to feel ashamed of her large frame, Lucien worshipped her expanding waistline and heavy thighs as if she were a Renaissance goddess. He showered her with diamonds purchased through Windsor, and company jewelers draped her in custom maternity gowns and rarely let her out of his sight. However, the syndicate did not stop spinning just because its boss had found a queen. The Costello organization's legitimate front, Lakeshore Logistics, was bleeding capital. The rival faction, led by the ruthless Carmine family, had begun aggressively intercepting their shipping routes along the interstate. Tensions within Lucien's inner circle were boiling over. His second-in-command, Dominic, a lean, calculating man who had grown up in the gutters alongside Lucien, was increasingly vocal about his displeasure. Dominic despised Amelia. He viewed her as a massive, glaring vulnerability. To him, she wasn't just a maid who had slept her way to the top. She was a soft, fat distraction, making their leader weak. One suffocatingly hot Friday in late July, Lucien was forced to attend an emergency sit-down at a heavily guarded warehouse on the south side to negotiate a ceasefire. He left Amelia at the estate with a detail of his most trusted men explicitly ordering that she was not to leave the third floor. Amelia was resting in the master suite, reading a book when the power to the entire mansion suddenly cut out. The hum of the central air conditioning died, and the impenetrable silence of the estate became deafening. Her heart began to race. The emergency backup generators, which were supposed to kick in within 10 seconds, remained dead. The heavy oak doors of the master suite swung open, and Dominic stepped in, holding a silenced pistol. Two of Lucian's supposedly loyal guards dragged a third bleeding and unconscious, dropping him unceremoniously onto the hallway carpet. Well, well, Dominic sneered his eyes, raking over Amelia's heavy, terrified form as she struggled to push herself up from the plush armchair. Look at the boss's prized cow sitting in the dark. "What are you doing, Dominic?" Amelia demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the ice water in her veins. "Fixing a problem," Dominic spat, taking a step toward her. "Lucian has lost his mind. He's making reckless decisions because he's obsessed with a fat, useless servant. Carmine offered me a seat at his table and full control of the shipping routes. All I have to do is hand over the Costello heir and the woman who ruined my best friend." Amelia's hands flew to her pregnant stomach. "Lucian will kill you. He will tear you apart. Lucian is walking into an ambush as we speak." Dominic laughed coldly. "He's dead, and you're coming with me." Fear is a powerful paralyzer, but the primal, visceral instinct to protect one's unborn child is an untamed force of nature. As Dominic approached the silenced pistol, raised and a cruel, dismissive sneer twisting his features, he made the fatal, arrogant mistake of underestimating his opponent. He looked down and saw a terrified, slow, overweight woman cowering on the floor. He saw the maid who used to scrub the baseboards, the soft plaything his boss had foolishly elevated above her station. He didn't see the woman who had spent 2 grueling years invisibly memorizing every single inch, every architectural blind spot, and every classified security protocol of the Costello estate, while polishing its floors and dusting its surveillance cameras. He didn't realize that being invisible was a supreme tactical advantage. "Please." Amelia sobbed, her voice trembling violently as she faked a clumsy, heavy stumble backward. She allowed her knees to buckle, dropping her considerable weight heavily to the floor near the massive, ornate stone fireplace. She wrapped her arms protectively around her rounded belly. "Please don't hurt my baby. I'll do whatever you want." "Pathetic," Dominic scoffed, lowering his guard completely. His pistol dipped toward the floor. He stepped forward, reaching out with his free hand to grab her by the hair and drag her to her feet. "A street dog dressed up in diamonds is still a street dog. Let's go, sweetheart. Carmine is waiting." But Amelia wasn't reaching for the floor to cower. Her hand shot out with lightning precision, her fingers wrapping tightly around the heavy, solid brass fire poker, resting innocuously on the stone hearth. With a guttural scream fueled by pure, desperate adrenaline and the fierce, protective rage of a mother, she swung the brass rod with every ounce of her bodily strength. The heavy, unyielding metal connected with the side of Dominic's kneecap. The sickening, hollow crack of shattering bone echoed loudly in the cavernous master suite. Dominic's eyes widened in absolute shock before rolling back in his head as he howled in blinding agony. His leg buckled instantly, bending at an unnatural angle. The silenced pistol slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly onto the polished hardwood floor and sliding out of reach. Amelia didn't hesitate. She didn't freeze, and she certainly didn't run. Leveraging her heavy body weight, she threw herself forward, driving her shoulder squarely into Dominic's chest before he could even attempt to recover his balance. The sheer force of the physical impact sent him crashing backward. His skull slammed violently against the sharp, unforgiving edge of the imported marble coffee table. He slumped to the floor completely limp, a dark pool of crimson beginning to stain the expensive Persian rug beneath his head. Panting heavily, her chest heaving with exertion, Amelia scrambled to her feet. She lunged for the discarded gun, wrapping her shaking hands around the cold, heavy steel grip. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her mind was terrifyingly crystal clear. Footsteps pounded in the corridor. The two rogue guards, alerted by Dominic's scream and the crash of the table, were rushing toward the open double doors of the master suite. Amelia stepped over Dominic's unconscious, bleeding body. She remembered the hidden security panel concealed behind the towering Victorian oil portrait in the outer corridor, a fail-safe system entirely separate from the main power grid, designed by Lucian for extreme, apocalyptic lockdown scenarios. She sprinted toward the wall, her soft silk maternity dress billowing around her ankles, and tore the heavy painting down. She slammed her fist into the exposed panel, driving her palm against the glowing red manual override button, just as the first guard rounded the corner, his weapon raised. Instantly, the estate's defense mechanisms roared to life. 2-inch-thick, reinforced titanium shutters slammed down over the massive windows, plunging the room into twilight, while heavy steel blast doors violently slid out from the doorframes. The barrier sealed shut with a deafening metallic clang, just a fraction of a second before the guards could breach the threshold. Amelia stood on the safe side, separated from the armed traitors by bulletproof glass and impenetrable steel mesh. The guards shouted furiously, banging their fists and kicking against the reinforced barrier, entirely locked out of the master wing. They were trapped in the corridor, cut off from their prize and cut off from their escape route. Amelia slowly backed away from the barricade, the pistol still gripped tightly in her hands. She had secured the perimeter. The Costello heir was safe. Now she just had to wait for the king to return. The adrenaline slowly began to recede, replaced by a cold, resolute calm she had never experienced before. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a mother, a survivor, and the keeper of this empire. She walked back into the master suite, grabbed a pair of heavy braided silk curtain tiebacks, and meticulously bound Dominic's wrists and ankles to the heavy oak legs of a sitting chair. 4 agonizing hours later, the titanium shutters mechanically whirred and lifted. The emergency power had finally been fully restored to the estate, bathing the room in warm, golden light. The heavy blast doors slid open. Lucian strode into the master suite, accompanied by 3 of his most loyal enforcers. He was a terrifying sight. His bespoke charcoal suit was torn, his knuckles were bruised, and his white shirt was completely soaked in blood that clearly wasn't his own. He had survived Carmine's ambush by the skin of his teeth, executing the traitors on the spot, and tearing through the city like a madman, the moment he realized communications to the estate were jammed. He expected to find a massacre. He expected to find his world destroyed. Instead, Lucian stopped dead in his tracks, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wide with utter disbelief. The master suite looked like a war zone, but the casualties were entirely one-sided. Dominic was bound tightly to the armchair, awake now, but groaning pitifully through a shattered jaw and a completely destroyed knee, and sitting directly across from the traitor, entirely unharmed, resting comfortably in a plush velvet chair with a loaded gun held perfectly steady in her lap, was Amelia. She looked up as Lucian entered. Her soft round face was smeared with a faint trace of soot from the fireplace. Her beautiful maternity dress was rumpled and stained with Dominic's blood, but her eyes were remarkably calm. They were cold, hard, and blazing with a terrifying, beautiful authority that made the breath catch in Lucian's throat. "He sold you out to Carmine," Amelia stated, her voice steady and commanding in the silent room. "He disabled the primary generators to blind the security cameras. I locked down the wing, trapped his men in the corridor, and kept him here for you." Lucian stared at the woman he had forcibly kept caged. He had selfishly thought of her as soft, fragile, and in desperate need of his absolute overbearing protection. He had loved her warmth, but he had entirely underestimated the immense, unyielding steel that forged her spine. She wasn't just his captive anymore. She had just proven herself beyond a shadow of a doubt to be his absolute equal. She had protected his legacy when his own men had failed him. Slowly, a dark, fiercely proud smile spread across Lucian's scarred face. The tension drained from his shoulders. He walked across the room, gently taking the heavy gun from her trembling hands, and pulled her up into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her skin, mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder. "My queen," he murmured against her collarbone, his voice thick with raw emotion and unwavering devotion. "My brilliant, lethal, beautiful queen." Dominic watched in absolute horror, coughing on his own blood, realizing far too late that the woman he had so arrogantly dismissed as a fat, invisible servant was the very architect of his total destruction. Amelia rested her head against Lucian's broad chest, feeling the steady, thundering beat of his heart against her cheek. She had entered this violent world as a ghost, forced into a velvet trap by a ruthless man who had refused to let her go. But as she looked down at the defeated, broken traitor bleeding on her expensive carpet, she realized she no longer had any desire to escape. The Mafia boss had trapped her, but in doing so, he had handed her the keys to an empire. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was Amelia Costello, the matriarch of Chicago's most feared syndicate, and heaven help anyone who ever dared to underestimate her again. Did Amelia's shocking transformation from an invisible maid to the fearless matriarch of the Costello Empire leave you completely breathless? If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love dramatic power reversals, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, dark romance sagas every single week. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a wild twist. See you in the next video.